This is getting out of control, so let's talk about how Israel is destroying us. A lot of people have come to the conclusion that Israel is evil, and some even believe that Israel is controlled by Satan himself. But most people just don't understand how we got here. So here are the 7 ways that Israel is destroying us. Number 7. They lived among us. For thousands of years, Jews were scattered among the nations because they didn't have their own country. And for most of history, they had no state of their own. They lived under the rule of the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and eventually the Arabs. In Europe, they were ruled over by kings and queens, and more often than not, they were persecuted and killed. And after the French Revolution, when the ideas of nationalism took hold, Jews in Europe identified themselves as a nation of Israel and began calling for a Jewish state of their own. When World War II came around, the Germans took this one step further and decided that the Jews should be exterminated from Europe. And so it was that in 1942, the Germans assembled all of the Jews from across their territories and sent them to camps, where they would be worked to death or simply murdered on arrival. As many as 6 million Jews were murdered by the Nazis, and after the war, surviving Jews wanted to find a place where they could finally be safe. Number 6, we gave them our country. After the Holocaust, the international community felt guilty about what had happened to the Jews, and so they promised to help the Jews establish their very own country. And that's when the United Nations came to a vote to divide British-controlled Palestine into 2 separate states, one Arab and one Jewish. But the Arabs rejected this plan and refused to accept the creation of a Jewish state. But the British were ready to get out of the Middle East, and the Americans were ready to fill the power vacuum. And so when Israel was officially declared an independent state on May 14, 1948, the US became its greatest ally. This was despite the fact that most of the American people were inexactly thrilled about creating another powerful ally in the region. But President Truman wanted to make sure that the US would be left behind as the rest of the world scrambled for colonies. It also didn't hurt that Truman was a strong supporter of Zionism. He once famously said, "I believe with all my heart that there is a special providence in the affairs of man, and I believe that the founding of the State of Israel was a moment in which that providence was particularly clear in the affairs of our time." But he did not expect that his decision would cause such a huge rift between the Arabs and the Israelis. Number 5, they attacked first. When Israel was first created, they knew that the surrounding Arab nations weren't too happy about their new state, and so they expected attacks from the surrounding nations. And so 5 days after Israel declared independence, the Egyptians, the Transjordanians, the Iraqis, the Syrians, and the Lebanese all declared war on Israel. And that's why it was that Israel attacked first. They had no choice but to go on the offensive in order to defend themselves. So they managed to take Jerusalem, Jaffa, Bethlehem, Ramlah, and more. But then the surrounding nations sent in their armies to take back what they lost. And as soon as the fighting broke out, the Israelis knew that they couldn't win. The Egyptians alone had a 20,000-man army, while the Israelis only had 35,000 trained soldiers, most of whom were volunteers. And so they had to ask the British to save them, which they did by sending in the Royal Air Force. But then the Americans stepped in and forced the British to stop. And so the UN stepped in to mediate the conflict. And the result was the 1949 Armistice Agreements, which basically gave Israel everything it conquered during the war. And so it was that Israel went from being a small desert state to suddenly owning the West Bank, Gaza, Golan Heights, and East Jerusalem. Number 4, we let them commit war crimes. There's a common saying that if your neighbor's house is on fire, you should help him put it out before the wind changes direction and your house catches fire too. But that's exactly what we failed to do with Israel. See, when Israel occupied the Palestinian territory, they quickly set about changing the demographics of the region. Soon as they took control of Gaza and the West Bank, they began building settlements for Jews in the middle of the Palestinian cities. This meant that the Palestinians were quickly outnumbered and outvoted, and this led to decades of unrest and violence. In response, the Israelis built a wall around the settlements to keep the Palestinians out. And that wall has now become one of the most heavily fortified borders in the world. Now this has made the lives of the Palestinians terrible. Their economy has been devastated, and their freedom of movement has been completely restricted. They're trapped in poverty, and they can't even move freely within their own country. And so it's no wonder that many of them want the Israelis gone. Number 3, we let them get away with it. In the early days of the occupation, the Palestinians protested the Israeli takeover by launching Fedayeen raids into Israeli territory. These attacks resulted in many Israeli deaths, and so the Israelis responded by launching retaliatory strikes into the Palestinian territories. The problem is that these reprisals were often disproportionate, and the Palestinians would suffer terrible losses in terms of life and property. But the worst part was that the Israelis never faced any consequences for their actions. The Americans always had their backs, and they never suffered any repercussions for their actions. And so the Palestinians grew more and more frustrated, and began launching more and more attacks until eventually the Israelis decided enough was enough. They launched an invasion into Gaza and the West Bank in order to crush the Palestinian resistance once and for all. And so the world watched in horror as the Israelis marched through Palestinian cities, burning them to the ground and killing anyone who stood in their way. But still, the Israelis didn't face any consequences for their actions. And so many people believe that the Israelis feel that they can do whatever they want and get away with it. That's why so many people believe that Israel is evil. Number 2, they have the best propaganda in the world. The Israelis have done a great job at making sure that the world sees them as the victims. And the biggest part of that is the Holocaust. You see, the Holocaust was one of the most horrific events in human history, and it's something that we should never forget. It reminds us of the dangers of unchecked hatred and the importance of standing up for what's right. But the Israelis have taken this tragedy and turned it into a weapon of war. They use the Holocaust to justify their occupation of Palestinian territory and their mistreatment of Palestinians. They say that they're doing it to prevent another Holocaust from happening. But all they're doing is causing their own people to commit atrocities. That's why so many people believe that Israel is controlled by Satan himself. Number 1, they're destroying the world. The truth is that Israel is dangerous for the whole world. They're a small country with a big stick, and they're not afraid to use it. They've launched missile strikes against civilian targets in Syria and Lebanon. They've bombed hospitals, schools, and even a Red Cross building. The VA also carried out assassinations on foreign soil, and the VA even waged war against a US ally. But the most dangerous thing about Israel is their nuclear weapons program. They won't say that they have nukes, but everyone knows that they do, and that makes them a potential target for terrorists. If Israel were to be attacked by a terrorist group with a nuclear weapon, the whole world would be at risk. That's why so many countries think that the US is the servant of Israel. They're afraid that the US will get dragged into another Israeli war, and that it could potentially lead to the end of the world. But do you agree with these points? Let me know in the comments below. And as usual, if you like this kind of videos, please like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more interesting videos. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.